History remembers some voices clearly and others only faintly. Across centuries, certain figures are celebrated in monuments and liturgy, their words preserved in sacred texts, their actions commemorated in ritual and art. Others leave only traces, fragments of papyrus, contested passages, allusions in writings that survive by chance. The distance between what happened and what is remembered is filled by tradition, interpretation, and the needs of communities trying to understand their origins. Memory shapes belief, and belief shapes memory, until the two become inseparable. In the history of Christianity, few figures illustrate this dynamic more vividly than Mary Magdalene. She appears in the canonical Gospels as a witness to the most important events in Christian theology, yet for much of Christian history she has been remembered primarily through images that do not appear in those same Gospels. The woman who stood at the cross and encountered the risen Christ became, in later tradition, a repentant prostitute, a symbol of sin redeemed. How this transformation occurred and what it obscured is a question that has occupied historians, theologians, and scholars of religion for generations. The study of early Christianity has expanded dramatically in recent decades. The discovery of ancient texts, many of them preserved in the dry sands of Egypt, has revealed a far more diverse landscape of belief and practice than was previously understood. Among these texts are writings that portray Mary Magdalene not as a penitent sinner, but as a teacher, a visionary, and a figure of spiritual authority. In some of these works, she is connected with Sophia, the personification of divine wisdom, a figure who appears in Jewish scripture, Gnostic cosmology, and early Christian reflection. This connection is not a matter of historical identity. There is no credible evidence that Mary Magdalene was believed to be the literal embodiment of a cosmic being. Rather, the association is symbolic, textual, and theological. It reflects a way of thinking about knowledge, insight, and the transmission of sacred understanding that was present in certain streams of early Christian thought, but eventually marginalized as orthodoxy took shape. To explore this connection is to enter a world of interpretation, where symbols carry meaning across different levels of reality, where figures in narrative represent principles as well as persons, and where the language of myth and metaphor is taken seriously as a way of expressing truth. It is also to confront the historical reality that early Christianity was not uniform. There were debates about authority, about who had the right to teach, about which writings were authoritative and which were not. Some voices were amplified, others were silenced, and the reasons for this were as much social and political as they were theological. Understanding Mary Magdalene's place in this history requires looking both at what the earliest texts say about her and at how those texts were read, rewritten, and remembered over time. The canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John provide the foundational portrait of Mary Magdalene. She is mentioned by name more than most of the male disciples. In all four Gospels, she is present at the crucifixion of Jesus, a detail of profound significance given that many of his male followers had fled. She witnesses his death, observes where his body is laid, and in the accounts of Matthew, Mark, and John, she is among the first to discover the empty tomb. In the Gospel of John, Mary Magdalene is given an especially prominent role. She comes to the tomb alone, finds it empty, runs to tell Peter and the beloved disciple, and then returns to the garden. There she encounters the risen Jesus. Though at first she does not recognize him, he speaks her name and she responds. He instructs her to go to the disciples and tell them what she has seen. In this moment she becomes what later Christian tradition would call the apostle to the apostles, the one sent to proclaim the resurrection to those who would proclaim it to the world. This is the Mary Magdalene of the canonical texts, a devoted follower, a witness to suffering and transformation, a messenger of the central event of Christian faith. There is nothing in these texts to suggest that she was a prostitute, nothing to indicate that she was the woman who anointed Jesus' feet in the Gospel of Luke, nothing to support the conflation of her identity with other women mentioned in the Gospel narratives. Yet by the late 6th century, in a homily delivered by Pope Gregory I, Mary Magdalene was identified with both the sinful woman of Luke's Gospel and with Mary of Bethany, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. This conflation, which has no basis in the biblical text itself, became entrenched in Western Christian tradition and shaped how Mary Magdalene was portrayed in art, literature, and popular devotion for more than 1,000 years. The reasons for this transformation are complex. Part of the explanation lies in the interpretation of a single verse in the Gospel of Luke, which states that Jesus cast 7 demons out of Mary Magdalene. In the ancient world, possession by demons could signify various forms of illness or affliction, not necessarily moral transgression, but in later interpretation, this detail became associated with sin, and from there it was a short step to identifying her with the unnamed sinful woman who appears earlier in Luke's narrative, weeping at Jesus' feet and anointing them with expensive oil. The merging of these figures created a composite character, a woman saved from a life of sin, whose gratitude and love for Jesus were proportional to the depth of her former degradation. This image resonated powerfully in a Christian culture that emphasized repentance, conversion, and the redemptive power of grace. It also fit within a broader pattern in which female figures in Christian tradition were often defined by their sexuality, whether as virgins or as repentant sinners, rather than by their spiritual insight or leadership. The historical Mary Magdalene, as she appears in the earlier sources, does not fit neatly into either of these categories. She is not described as a virgin, nor is she described as a prostitute. She is a woman of means. Luke mentions that she and other women provided for Jesus and his disciples out of their own resources, and she is clearly a person of significance within the community of Jesus' followers. Her presence at the crucifixion and the empty tomb suggests courage, loyalty, and a role that was recognized and remembered. The fact that all four Gospels name her in these contexts, when the names of other witnesses vary or are omitted, indicates that her testimony was considered important. In the culture of the time, women's testimony was often discounted in legal settings, yet here a woman is entrusted with the most important message in Christian proclamation. This is a detail that early Christian communities preserved even as it created tension with prevailing social norms. The tension between Mary Magdalene's role as witness and the cultural discomfort with female authority becomes more explicit in texts outside the canonical New Testament. Among the writings discovered in the 20th century, particularly those found at Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 45, are several that feature Mary Magdalene as a central figure. The most significant of these is the Gospel of Mary, a fragmentary text that survives in Greek and Coptic versions and likely dates to the 2nd century. In this text, Mary Magdalene is portrayed as a disciple who receives private revelation from the risen Jesus and shares this teaching with the other disciples. Her teaching is met with resistance, particularly from Peter, who questions whether Jesus would really have spoken to a woman in this way and shared knowledge with her that he did not share with the male disciples. Another disciple, Levi, defends Mary, pointing out that Jesus loved her more than the other disciples and that they should listen to her words rather than rejecting them out of jealousy. The Gospel of Mary is not a historical transcript. It is a theological text, composed decades after the events it narrates, reflecting the concerns and conflicts of the community that produced it. What it reveals is that in at least some early Christian circles, there was a memory of Mary Magdalene as a teacher and a transmitter of esoteric knowledge. It also reveals that this role was contested. The resistance from Peter in the text likely reflects real disputes about authority and legitimacy in early Christian communities. Who had the right to teach? What criteria determined whether a teaching was authentic? Was apostolic authority based on having been with Jesus during his earthly ministry, or on having received revelation from the reason? Christ. These were not abstract questions. They had practical implications for how communities were organized, who led worship, who interpreted Scripture, and whose voices were heard. The Gospel of Mary presents a model of authority based on spiritual insight rather than institutional position. Mary's knowledge comes not from having been chosen as one of the 12, but from her intimate relationship with Jesus and her ability to understand his teaching. The text describes her as someone who sees clearly, who does not waver, and who has turned her heart toward the good. These are qualities associated with wisdom. In the Gospel of Mary, knowledge is not simply information transmitted from teacher to student. It is a transformation of the self, a turning toward the divine, a recovery of something that was lost. This way of thinking about knowledge has deep roots in Jewish and Hellenistic traditions, where wisdom is personified as a feminine figure who calls out to humanity, offering understanding and life. Sophia is the Greek word for wisdom, and in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, Sophia appears as a distinct character, especially in the books of Proverbs, Wisdom of Solomon and Sirach. In Proverbs, wisdom is present at the creation of the world, delighting in the works of God and calling people to follow her paths. In the Wisdom of Solomon, she is described as a breath of the power of God, a reflection of eternal light, an image of divine goodness. She is active, creative, and intimately involved in the world. She enters into holy souls and makes them friends of God and prophets. She is more beautiful than the sun and excels every constellation of stars. She is the one who guided the righteous and delivered them from their enemies. This portrayal of wisdom as a feminine divine presence who mediates between God and humanity influenced Jewish mysticism, early Christian theology, and the various Gnostic movements that flourished in the first centuries of the Common Era. In Gnostic texts, Sophia often plays a central role in cosmological narratives that explain the origin of the material world and the human condition. Gnosticism is not a single religion, but a term used by scholars to describe a range of religious movements that shared certain themes. The belief that the material world is flawed or even evil, that human beings contain a spark of divine light trapped in matter, and that salvation comes through knowledge, gnosis, of one's true nature and origin. In many Gnostic myths, Sophia is a divine being, an emanation of the highest God who falls or errs, and whose fall is somehow connected to the creation of the material cosmos. Her story is one of exile and return, of loss and recovery, of wisdom seeking to restore what has been fragmented. She represents the soul's journey from forgetfulness to remembrance, from ignorance to knowledge, from captivity to freedom. The details of Sophia's story vary widely across different Gnostic texts, but certain patterns recur. In some versions, Sophia desires to know the unknowable God, and in her desire creates something flawed or incomplete. In others, she acts without her divine consort and produces an offspring, the demiurge, who creates the material world in ignorance, thinking himself to be the only God. Humanity is created by this lesser God, but Sophia, or a higher divine power, secretly implants in human beings a spark of divine light, the potential for gnosis. The material world is thus a place of ignorance and suffering, but also a place where the divine spark can be awakened and returned to its source. Sophia herself is often in need of redemption, and her restoration is linked to the restoration of all who possess the divine spark. She is both the one who fell and the one who guides the return, both the cause of the problem and part of the solution. This way of thinking about Sophia is deeply symbolic. It should not be read as a literal cosmology in the modern sense, but as a mythological framework for expressing existential and spiritual truths. The fall of Sophia represents the human experience of alienation, of feeling separated from the source of being, of living in a world that does not feel like home. Her longing to return represents the soul's inherent orientation toward the divine, the sense that there is something more, something higher, something true that has been forgotten. The knowledge she offers is not intellectual information, but experiential insight, a direct perception of reality that transforms the knower. In Gnostic thought, this knowledge is salvific. To know one's true nature, to remember one's origin, is to be free. The connection between Mary Magdalene and Sophia in certain early Christian and Gnostic texts is not a simple identification. Mary is not presented as the cosmic figure Sophia, but she is portrayed in ways that evoke the characteristics and functions of Sophia in the Gospel. Of Mary, she is a teacher who imparts hidden knowledge. In the Pistis Sophia, a lengthy Gnostic text, Mary Magdalene is the most prominent questioner and interpreter of Jesus' teachings, surpassing the male disciples in understanding. The text attributes to her a special ability to perceive spiritual realities and to articulate them clearly. She is praised for her insight and her willingness to speak. She is associated with light, understanding, and the revelation of mysteries. These are all qualities associated with Sophia. The Pistis. Sophia is a complex and difficult text, filled with elaborate cosmological descriptions, hymns, and dialogues. It was likely composed in the 3rd century and reflects a form of Gnostic Christianity that was already quite developed and systematized. In this text, Jesus, after his resurrection, spends 11 years teaching his disciples about the mysteries of the heavenly realms. Mary Magdalene is by far the most active participant in these discussions. She asks more questions than anyone else, she offers interpretations, and she is repeatedly commended by Jesus for her understanding. At one point, Jesus tells her that she is blessed above all women on earth and that she will be perfected in all the mysteries of the height. In another passage, Peter complains that Mary speaks too much and dominates the conversation, preventing the men from speaking. Jesus responds by affirming that anyone who is inspired by the Spirit should speak, regardless of gender. The prominence of Mary Magdalene in the Pistis Sophia and other Gnostic texts suggests that in some early Christian communities, She was remembered as a figure of spiritual authority and wisdom. This memory may have been rooted in historical reality. Perhaps she was indeed a teacher and leader in the earliest Jesus movement. Or it may have been a later development, a way of affirming the value of feminine insight and challenging the male-dominated structures that were becoming entrenched in mainstream Christianity. Either way, these texts present an alternative vision of Christian origins, one in which women were not marginal but central, not solent but eloquent, not passive but active in shaping belief and practice. The symbolic association of Mary Magdalene with Sophia also reflects a broader theological idea that wisdom, understood as divine insight and transformative knowledge, is available to those who are open to it, regardless of social status or gender. In the patriarchal context of the ancient Mediterranean world, where women's voices were often excluded from public discourse and religious authority, the figure of Mary Magdalene as wisdom teacher represents a counter-narrative. She embodies the possibility that the divine can speak through anyone, that spiritual authority is not determined by institutional position, but by the quality of one's understanding and the depth of one's relationship with the sacred. This idea was threatening to those who sought to establish a hierarchical church structure based on apostolic succession and male leadership. It is not surprising, then, that texts featuring Mary Magdalene in this way were eventually excluded from the canon and labelled as heretical. The process by which certain texts were accepted as authoritative and others were rejected was gradual and contested. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, there was no single agreed-upon list of Christian scriptures. Different communities used different texts. Some emphasized the letters of Paul, others valued Gospels that did not make it into the final New Testament canon, such as the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter. The criteria for canonicity, apostolic authorship, widespread use, consistency with received tradition, were applied unevenly and were often matters of debate. Theological disputes were intertwined with political struggles for control of the church. Those who had the power to define orthodoxy also had the power to marginalize alternative voices. By the 4th century, with the support of the Roman Empire, a relatively standardized Christian orthodoxy began to emerge, and texts that did not conform to this orthodoxy were suppressed, destroyed, or forgotten. The exclusion of texts like the Gospel of Mary and the Pistis Sophia from the canon meant that the portrayal of Mary Magdalene as a teacher and wisdom figure was largely lost to later generations. What remained in the canonical Gospels was her role as witness, which was significant but more limited. The conflation of her identity with the sinful woman and with Mary of Bethany, while not based on the biblical text, became the dominant narrative in Western Christianity. This narrative served certain theological purposes. It illustrated the power of repentance and forgiveness. It provided a model of devotion and love, but it also obscured the fuller picture of who Mary Magdalene might have been and what she might have represented in the earliest Christian movement. The recovery of that fuller picture began in earnest in the modern period, with the critical study of biblical text and the discovery of extra-canonical writings. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in 1945, brought to light a wealth of Gnostic texts that had been hidden for more than 1,500 years. Scholars could now read these texts and compare them with the canonical Gospels, tracing the development of early Christian thought and reconstructing the diversity of belief and practice in the first centuries. The Gospel of Mary was among these discoveries, though fragments of it had been found earlier in the 20th century. Reading this text alongside the canonical Gospels made it clear that Mary Magdalene's role had been more complex and more contested than later tradition suggested. Contemporary scholarship on Mary Magdalene is careful to distinguish between what can be known historically and what is a matter of interpretation. Historically, Mary Magdalene was a follower of Jesus, a witness to his crucifixion and resurrection, and a person whose testimony was valued by the early Christian community. Beyond this, the evidence is fragmentary and open to interpretation. The texts that portray her as a teacher and a recipient of special revelation were written by communities that had their own theological agendas and their own ways of understanding Christian origins. These texts are valuable sources for understanding the diversity of early Christianity, but they do not provide direct access to the historical Mary Magdalene. What they do provide is evidence that some early Christians saw in Mary Magdalene a symbol of wisdom, insight, and spiritual authority. The symbolic connection between Mary Magdalene and Sophia can be understood on several levels. On a textual level, both figures are associated with knowledge, revelation, and the transmission of divine truth. On a theological level, both represent the idea that wisdom is hidden or forgotten and must be recovered through spiritual practice and insight, On a psychological level, both can be seen as representing aspects of the self that have been marginalized or oppressed, and that need to be integrated for wholeness to be achieved. This last interpretation has been particularly influential in Jungian psychology, and in feminist theology, where the figure of Sophia is seen as representing the feminine dimension of the divine, and the figure of Mary Magdalene as embodying the recovery of feminine spiritual authority. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist and founder of analytical psychology, wrote extensively about the role of symbols in the psyche and the importance of integrating unconscious contents into consciousness. He saw religious symbols as expressions of archetypal patterns that exist in the collective unconscious, patterns that shape human experience across cultures and historical periods. The archetype of the wise woman or the divine feminine, which appears in many cultures in figures like Athena, Isis, Kuan Yin, and Sophia, presents qualities such as intuition, compassion, nurturing, and holistic understanding. In patriarchal cultures, these qualities have often been devalued or suppressed, leading to an imbalance in both individual and collective life. The recovery of the feminine archetype, Jung suggested, is essential for psychological wholeness and for the healing of the wounds caused by one-sided emphasis on masculine values such as rationality, hierarchy, and control. Feminist theologians have built on this psychological insight, arguing that the marginalization of Mary Magdalene and the suppression of Sophia in Christian tradition reflect the broader marginalization of women in the church and in society. By reclaiming Mary Magdalene as a teacher, and by recognizing Sophia as a legitimate representation of the divine, these theologians seek to expand the range of images and narratives available to people of faith. They argue that an exclusively male understanding of God and an exclusively male clergy perpetuate patterns of domination and exclusion that are contrary to the liberating message of the gospel. The figure of Mary Magdalene, seen in her fullness as witness, teacher, and wisdom bearer, offers an alternative model of discipleship and leadership. This feminist theological project has been both celebrated and criticized. Supporters see it as the necessary correction to centuries of gender bias and as a way of making Christianity more inclusive and more true to its origins. Critics worry that it imposes contemporary concerns onto ancient texts, that it downplays the historical diversity of women's roles in early Christianity, or that it creates new forms of essentialism by assuming that wisdom and compassion are inherently feminine qualities. These debates are ongoing and reflect broader disagreements about how to interpret religious texts, how to balance historical accuracy with contemporary relevance, and how to navigate the relationship between tradition and change. What is clear is that the question of Mary Magdalene's identity and role cannot be separated from larger questions about authority, gender, and the nature of religious knowledge. The texts that feature her prominently, whether canonical or extra-canonical, were all written in contexts where these questions were live issues. The fact that her role as witness was preserved in the canonical Gospels, despite cultural biases against women's testimony, suggests that her presence at the resurrection was too well established in the community's memory to be erased. The fact that other texts portray her as a teacher and visionary suggests that at least some communities continued to honour her in that role, even as the mainstream church moved in a different direction. The later conflation of her identity with the sinful woman suggests that when her role as teacher could no longer be easily accommodated within the emerging structures of orthodoxy, it was replaced with a different narrative that fit more comfortably with prevailing assumptions about women's roles. The connection between Mary Magdalene and Sophia, as it appears in certain Gnostic texts, is part of a larger pattern in which spiritual authority is grounded not in institutional position, but in direct experience of the divine. Gnosis, the knowledge that saves, is not something that can be learned from books or handed down through a chain of command. It is immediate, personal, and transformative. It comes through revelation, through inner vision, through the opening of the spiritual eye. In this framework, Mary Magdalene is not important because she was appointed to a position, or because she had credentials that could be verified. She is important because she saw, because she understood, because she was able to communicate what she had experienced in a way that helped others to see and understand as well. This is the role of Sophia in wisdom literature, to call out, to teach, to guide those who are willing to listen. It is a role that transcends gender, though it has often been symbolized in feminine form. The idea that wisdom is hidden and must be sought is central to both Gnostic Christianity and to the Jewish wisdom tradition. In the book of Proverbs, wisdom calls out in the streets, but many do not hear. She offers her gifts freely, but they must be desired and pursued. In the Gnostic texts, knowledge of one's true nature and origin is obscured by the distractions and illusions of the material world, and it requires effort and guidance to recover. The hiddenness of wisdom is not because it is deliberately concealed by a malevolent force, though some Gnostic texts do portray it that way, but because human beings are forgetful, distracted, and attached to things that ultimately do not satisfy. The recovery of wisdom is a kind of awakening, a remembering of what has always been true but has been covered over by layers of conditioning and ignorance. In this sense, Mary Magdalene can be seen as a symbol of the soul's journey toward wisdom. She moves from grief and confusion at the empty tomb to recognition and understanding when Jesus speaks her name. She is sent to proclaim what she has seen, to bear witness to the resurrection, to communicate a truth that others need to hear. This movement from darkness to light, from not knowing to knowing, from silence to speech, mirrors the journey described in wisdom literature and in Gnostic texts. It is a journey that anyone can make, regardless of gender or status, but it requires openness, courage, and a willingness to see things differently. The Gospel of John's account of Mary Magdalene at the tomb has been read in this symbolic way by many interpreters. She comes to the tomb while it is still dark, a detail that suggests both literal time of day and spiritual state. She sees that the stone has been rolled away and assumes that the body has been taken. She runs to tell Peter and the beloved disciple, who come, look, and leave. Mary remains weeping. Her grief is not just for the loss of Jesus, but for the loss of meaning, the collapse of hope. Then she looks into the tomb and sees two angels, who ask her why she is weeping. She turns and sees Jesus, but does not recognize him, thinking he is the gardener. It is only when he speaks her name, Mary, that she recognizes him and responds, Rabboni, which means teacher. He tells her not to hold on to him, but to go and tell the others. She goes and announces, I have seen the Lord. This narrative is rich with symbolic meaning. The darkness at the beginning suggests spiritual blindness, or the absence of understanding. The empty tomb is a puzzle, a problem that demands interpretation. Mary's weeping represents the soul's lament over its lost connection with the divine. The appearance of angels, messengers of the divine realm, signals a transition from ordinary perception to spiritual insight. The figure of the gardener evokes the Garden of Eden, the place of original communion between God and humanity, and also the Garden of Resurrection, where death is overcome. The moment of recognition, manin, when Jesus speaks her name, is the moment of gnosis, the sudden realization of who he is and who she is in relation to him. The command not to hold on suggests that spiritual truth cannot be possessed or clung to. It must be shared, proclaimed, and lived. For interpreters who see Mary Magdalene as connected with Sophia, this narrative is a paradigm of the wisdom journey. Wisdom seeks those who are lost in darkness. She reveals herself to those who long for understanding. She calls them by name, addressing them personally and intimately. She sends them out to share what they have learned. The encounter with the risen Christ in the garden is not just a historical event, but a pattern of spiritual experience, a template for how divine wisdom meets the human soul and transforms it. In this reading, Mary Magdalene is not simply a historical individual who happened to be in the right place at the right time. She is a symbol of the receptive heart, the one who stays when others leave, the one who weeps and seeks and finally sees. This symbolic reading does not negate the historical reality of Mary Magdalene, but it adds a layer of meaning that goes beyond the purely historical. It invites readers to see themselves in the story, to recognize their own journey in her journey, to consider how they might encounter wisdom in their own lives. This kind of reading has been practiced throughout Christian history, particularly in the mystical and contemplative traditions, where biblical narratives are understood as allegories of the soul's relationship with God. The literal meaning of the text is honored, but it is also seen as pointing toward deeper truths that can be experienced directly. The marginalization of this symbolic and mystical approach in much of Western Christianity has been connected by some scholars to the broader marginalization of feminine imagery and feminine leadership. When the church became increasingly hierarchical and institutional, when theology became more systematized and doctrinal, when the emphasis shifted from personal spiritual experience to correct belief and proper ecclesiastical authority, the wisdom tradition, with its emphasis on inner knowing, direct revelation, and the feminine divine, became suspect. Texts that embodied this tradition, including those that featured Mary Magdalene prominently, were labelled as heretical. The figure of Sophia, so central in Jewish wisdom literature and in early Christian reflection, largely disappeared from mainstream theology, though she was never entirely absent. She reappears in Christian mysticism, in the visions of Hildegard of Bingen, in the writings of Jakob Böhme, in the Russian Sophiology of the 19th and 20th centuries. Each time she reappears, she challenges the prevailing emphasis on rationality, hierarchy, and masculine imagery. The 20th century saw a renewed interest in Sophia among theologians, philosophers, and spiritual seekers. This interest was fueled in part by the feminist movement, which critiqued the patriarchal structures of religious institutions and sought alternative images of the divine. It was also fueled by the encounter with Eastern religions, which offered models of the divine feminine that were more developed and more integrated into practice than those available in Western Christianity. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi texts and the increased scholarly attention to Gnostic Christianity provided new resources for thinking about Sophia and her relationship to figures like Mary Magdalene. Writers such as Elaine Pagels, Karen King, and Anne Graham Brock examined these texts and argued that they reveal a suppressed history, a version of Christianity in which women played leadership roles and in which the divine was imaged in both masculine and feminine terms. Elaine Pagels' influential book The Gnostic Gospels, published in 1979, introduced a wider audience to the Nag Hammadi texts and explored the implications of their discovery. Pagels argued that the Gnostic Christians were not simply heretics with strange cosmological ideas, but represented a different way of organizing religious community and understanding religious authority. In Gnostic groups, spiritual insight and personal revelation were valued over institutional position. Leadership was often more fluid and more inclusive of women. The sacred was experienced as immanent and immediate, not mediated exclusively through clergy and sacraments. This vision of Christianity, Pagels suggested, was suppressed because it threatened the emerging orthodoxy and the hierarchical church structure that orthodoxy supported. Karen King, in her work on the Gospel of Mary, has made similar arguments. She points out that the Gospel of Mary presents a model of apostolic authority based on spiritual maturity and vision, not on having been one of the 12 or on male gender. The conflict in the text between Mary and Peter reflects real conflicts in early Christian communities about who had the right to teach and interpret the words of Jesus. These conflicts were not settled by appealing to historical facts, who actually heard what Jesus said, but by appeals to tradition, to apostolic succession, to emerging creeds and canons. The voices that lost these conflicts, including the voice represented by the Gospel of Mary, were marginalized and eventually silenced. King argues that recovering these voices is important not just for historical accuracy, but for expanding the range of possibilities for contemporary Christian practice and belief. It is important to note that not all scholars agree with these interpretations. Some argue that the Gnostic texts are later developments and do not reflect the beliefs of the earliest Christian communities. Others point out that Gnostic Christianity, despite its more fluid leadership structures, had its own forms of elitism and exclusion, valuing spiritual knowledge in ways that could be just as hierarchical as the orthodoxy it opposed. Still others caution against romanticizing these texts, or using them to make sweeping claims about early Christian diversity. The evidence is fragmentary, the texts are difficult to interpret, and the historical context is complex. What can be said with confidence is that early Christianity was more diverse than later orthodoxy allowed, that debates about authority and gender were ongoing, and that Mary Magdalene was a figure around whom some of these debates crystallized. The symbolic association of Mary Magdalene with Sophia is best understood not as a historical claim, but as a theological and spiritual interpretation. It reflects a way of thinking about knowledge, wisdom, and the divine that was present in some streams of early Christian thought. It offers a counter-narrative to the dominant story of Christian origins, one that includes women as teachers and leaders, one that values inner experience and spiritual insight, one that images the divine in both masculine and feminine forms. This counter-narrative does not replace the canonical Gospels or the tradition that developed from them, but it enriches and complicates the picture, showing that there were always multiple ways of being Christian, multiple ways of understanding who Jesus was and what his message meant. For those who are drawn to this vision, Mary Magdalene becomes a guide, a symbol of the journey toward wisdom, and the recovery of what has been lost or forgotten. She represents the voice that was silenced but that continues to speak, the authority that was denied but that continues to be recognized by those who have ears to hear. She stands at the threshold between the old and the new, between death and resurrection, between not knowing and knowing. She embodies the hope that wisdom can be found, that truth can be known, that the divine can be encountered directly and personally. The return of the hidden wisdom of Sophia, as symbolized in the figure of Mary Magdalene, is not a return to a golden age that once existed and then was lost. There is no historical evidence of a matriarchal or egalitarian early Christianity that was later corrupted by patriarchal forces. The reality is more complicated and less romantic. What the texts do show is that from the beginning there were multiple voices, multiple perspectives, and ongoing struggles about authority, interpretation, and the nature of the divine. Some of these voices emphasized hierarchy, structure, and institutional continuity. Others emphasized spiritual experience, inner knowing, and the immediate presence of the divine. Both were part of the early Christian landscape, and both have continued in various forms throughout Christian history. The contemporary interest in Mary Magdalene and Sophia reflects a broader cultural moment in which traditional religious authority is being questioned, in which marginalized voices are being recovered, and in which there is a hunger for forms of spirituality that are more inclusive, more experiential, and more attentive to the feminine dimensions of the sacred. This interest is not confined to academic scholars or feminist theologians. It appears in popular culture, in novels and films, in art and music, in new religious movements, and in the creative reinterpretation of old traditions. Some of this interest is well-informed and historically grounded. Some of it is speculative and imaginative. The challenge is to hold these two together, to honour both the historical evidence and the spiritual longing, to be rigorous in interpretation while remaining open to the transformative power of symbol and myth. One of the persistent questions in the study of Mary Magdalene and Sophia is the relationship between historical fact and symbolic meaning. For some, the historical question is primary. What can we actually know about who Mary Magdalene was and what she did? For others, the symbolic question is more important. What does Mary Magdalene represent? And how can that representation be meaningful for people today? These two questions are not mutually exclusive, but they do require different methods and different kinds of evidence. Historical inquiry relies on texts, archaeology, and comparative analysis. It is cautious, tentative, and aware of the limits of what can be known. Symbolic interpretation relies on imagination, tradition, and the resonance of images and narratives with human experience. It is more fluid, more personal, and more willing to embrace ambiguity. The tension between these approaches is productive. Historical inquiry keeps symbolic interpretation honest, preventing it from becoming pure fantasy untethered from reality. Symbolic interpretation keeps historical inquiry relevant, preventing it from becoming dry antiquarianism disconnected from lived experience. The best scholarship on Mary Magdalene and Sophia holds both together, attending carefully to what the texts say and to the historical context in which they were written, while also asking what these texts mean and how they function as religious and cultural symbols. In the history of Christian thought, there have always been two ways of reading Scripture, the literal and the allegorical. The literal reading attends to what the text says on its surface, to the events it narrates and the teachings it contains. The allegorical reading looks for deeper meanings, seeing the literal story as pointing towards spiritual truths. Both are necessary. Without the literal reading, interpretation becomes arbitrary and ungrounded. Without the allegorical reading, Scripture remains a closed book, a record of the past with no living connection to the present. The great interpreters of Christian tradition, from Origen and Augustine to Teresa of Avila and Thomas Merton, practiced both kinds of reading, moving fluidly between the historical and the symbolic, between what the text meant in its original context and what it means now. The figure of Mary Magdalene invites this kind of reading. Literally, she is a first-century Jewish woman who followed Jesus, witnessed his death and resurrection, and whose testimony was foundational to early Christian proclamation. Allegorically, she is the soul-seeking God, the seeker of wisdom, the one who mourns what is lost and rejoices at what is found. She is the disciple who understands, the witness who speaks, the teacher who shares what she has learned. She is the one who was misunderstood and misrepresented, but who continues to challenge and inspire. She is the hidden wisdom that is being recovered, the silenced voice that is beginning to be heard. The wisdom that Sophia represents is not esoteric knowledge available only to a spiritual elite. It is the knowledge of how to live, how to love, how to see clearly, how to be fully human, is the knowledge that comes from paying attention, from listening deeply, from being present to oneself and to others. It is the knowledge that life is more than survival and accumulation, that there is a dimension of reality that transcends the material, that the sacred is present in the ordinary if we have eyes to see. This is the wisdom that Mary Magdalene embodies in the Gospel of John when she recognizes Jesus in the garden, when she shifts from grief to joy, from absence to presence. It is the wisdom she offers in the Gospel of Mary when she teaches the disciples what Jesus revealed to her, helping them to see beyond their limited perspectives and their anxieties. The recovery of this wisdom is not a matter of uncovering lost texts or reconstructing ancient rituals, though those things can be helpful. It is a matter of cultivating the qualities of attention, openness, and courage that allow wisdom to be recognized and received. It is a matter of questioning inherited assumptions, listening to voices that have been marginalized, and being willing to see familiar things in new ways. It is a matter of integrating the masculine and the feminine, the rational and the intuitive, the institutional and the charismatic, the tradition and the innovation. It is, in short, a matter of becoming whole. The image of Sophia as a feminine divine figure who seeks to restore what has been fragmented and to guide humanity back to its source is a powerful one. It speaks to the experience of alienation and the longing for reconnection that is so central to the human condition. It acknowledges that something has been lost, that we are not fully what we could be, that there is work to be done. But it also offers hope, the promise that restoration is possible, that wisdom is available, that the path home can be found. This hope is not based on naive optimism or on the denial of suffering and injustice. It is based on the conviction that at the heart of reality is a love and an intelligence that desires our flourishing, that calls us by name, that meets us in our searching and our sorrow. Mary Magdalene, in her connection with Sophia, becomes a symbol of that hope. She is the one who stayed when others fled, who sought when others despaired, who believed when belief seemed impossible. She is the one who was entrusted with the most important message, who was called to speak when speaking seemed futile. She is the one whose voice was diminished but not destroyed, whose witness was preserved even when it was misunderstood. She is a reminder that wisdom is resilient, that truth endures, that voices silenced in one age can be heard again in another. The scholarly work of recovering and interpreting texts like the Gospel of Mary and the Pistis Sophia is part of a larger project of historical justice and theological renewal. It seeks to tell a more complete story of Christian origins, one that includes the diversity of belief and practice that actually existed, one that acknowledges the roles of women and other marginalized groups, one that honors the complexity and the conflicts that shape the tradition. This work is not an attack on Christianity or on the Church. It is an effort to understand the tradition more fully, to see both its light and its shadows, to learn from its mistakes as well as its achievements. At the same time, the symbolic and spiritual engagement with the Mary Magdalene and Sophia is part of a larger search for meaning, for connection, for a way of being in the world that is more whole and more humane. This search is not limited to Christians or even to religious people. It is a human search, driven by the sense that something is missing, that life as it is commonly lived is not enough, that there must be more. The figure of Sophia, with her call to wisdom and her promise of transformation, speaks to this search. She offers an alternative to the dominant values of contemporary culture, the emphasis on consumption, competition, and control, and points toward values of compassion, cooperation, and contemplation. The return of the hidden wisdom of Sophia, then, is not a single event but an ongoing process. It happens whenever someone encounters a text or an image, or an idea that opens up new possibilities for understanding the divine and the human. It happens whenever someone challenges unjust structures or amplifies a silenced voice. It happens whenever someone chooses to see with the eyes of wisdom rather than the eyes of prejudice or fear. It happens in scholarship and in prayer, in art and in activism, in solitude and in community. It is a return that is always beginning, always unfolding, always inviting participation. The challenges to this return are real. There is resistance from those who benefit from existing power structures, who fear change, who find security and certainty and in clearly defined roles. There is the difficulty of interpretation, the fact that ancient texts do not speak unambiguously, that they were written in languages and cultural contexts far removed from our own, that they can be used to support very different agendas. There is the danger of romanticization, of projecting contemporary concerns onto the past, of creating a mythical golden age that never existed. There is the risk of division, of creating new forms of exclusion even while trying to overcome old ones. These challenges require humility, patience, and a commitment to ongoing dialogue. They require a willingness to live with ambiguity and to resist the temptation to simple answers. They require the recognition that the recovery of wisdom is not the possession of a single group or perspective, but a collective endeavour that benefits from multiple voices and multiple approaches. The wisdom of Sophia, if it is truly wisdom, will not lead to dogmatism or to the silencing of dissent. It will lead to deeper understanding, to greater compassion, to more just and more beautiful ways of living together. Mary Magdalene, as a historical figure and as a symbol, continues to provoke questions and to inspire reflection. Who was she really? What did she know? Why was her witness preserved in some texts and her teaching marginalized in others? What would it mean to take her seriously as a teacher and a bearer of wisdom? How might Christian faith and practice look different if her voice were heard more fully? These are not idle questions. They touch on fundamental issues of authority, gender, knowledge, and the nature of religious tradition. They invite us to reconsider assumptions that have shaped Christianity for centuries and to imagine new possibilities for the future. The scholarship on Mary Magdalene and Sophia is still developing. New texts continue to be discovered, and old texts continue to be reinterpreted. Debates about authenticity, dating, and meaning are ongoing. Consensus on many issues has not been reached and may never be, but this is as it should be. Wisdom is not a static body of knowledge that can be definitively catalogued and controlled. It is a living presence, a dynamic relationship, a conversation that continues across generations. The texts that feature Mary Magdalene, whether canonical or extra-canonical, are part of that conversation. They witness to the importance of her role in early Christian memory, and to the ongoing struggle to understand what that role means. For contemporary readers, engaging with these texts can be a way of entering into that conversation, of adding their own voices and their own questions. It can be a way of connecting with the long history of people who have sought wisdom, who have challenged injustice, who have worked to create communities of love and mutual support. It can be a way of honouring the past while remaining open to the future, of learning from tradition while not being bound by it. It can be a way of discovering that the search for wisdom is not a solitary endeavour but a shared journey, one that is enriched by the presence of others, by the diversity of perspectives and experiences that each person brings. The image of Mary Magdalene in the garden, encountering the risen Christ and being sent to proclaim what she has seen, remains one of the most powerful in Christian scripture. It speaks to the possibility of transformation, of moving from despair to hope, from death to life. It speaks to the value of staying present, of continuing to seek even when seeking seems pointless. It speaks to the importance of recognition, of seeing truly, of hearing one's name spoken with love, and it speaks to the responsibility of witness, of sharing what one has experienced, of becoming a voice for truth in a world that often prefers comfortable illusions. Whether one reads this narrative as history, as theology, as symbol, or as some combination of all three, its power endures. Mary Magdalene continues to stand at the threshold, inviting others to cross over, to see what she has seen, to know what she has known. She continues to embody the wisdom that seeks and finds, that mourns and rejoices, that speaks and is heard. She continues to represent the possibility that the divine can be encountered directly, that authority can be rooted in experience rather than position, that women as well as men can be teachers and leaders in the community of faith. The return of the hidden wisdom of Sophia, as symbolized in the recovery and reinterpretation of Mary Magdalene, is ultimately about wholeness. It is about integrating what has been split, honoring what has been denied, giving voice to what has been seized. It is about recognizing that the tradition is richer and more complex than any single narrative can capture, that there have always been multiple paths, multiple insights, multiple ways of understanding the sacred. It is about expanding the circle of who is included, who is heard, who is honoured. It is about creating space for the feminine as well as the masculine, the mystical as well as the rational, the experiential as well as the doctrinal. This work of integration and expansion is not easy. It requires courage to question what has been taken for granted, to challenge structures that seem unchangeable, to imagine alternatives to the way things are. It requires patience to engage with complex texts and difficult histories, to sit with ambiguity and uncertainty, to resist the pressure for quick conclusions. It requires humility to acknowledge what is not known, to listen to voices that are different from one's own, to be willing to change one's mind. And it requires hope, the trust that the effort is worthwhile, that wisdom can be found, that transformation is possible. The figure of Mary Magdalene, in all her complexity and all her mystery, offers a focal point for this work. She is both particular and universal, both a woman of first-century Palestine and a symbol that transcends time and place. She is both remembered and forgotten, both honoured and diminished. She is both witness and teacher, both follower and leader. She is both human and icon, both historical and mythic. In her multiplicity, she reflects the multiplicity of the tradition itself, the many voices and many visions that make up the Christian heritage. To engage with Mary Magdalene is to engage with the richness of that heritage, to explore its depths and its shadows, its achievements and its failures. It is to encounter the questions that every generation must ask anew. What is truth? Who has authority? How do we know what we know? What does it mean to be faithful? What does it mean to be free? These are the questions that the wisdom tradition asks, that Sophia asks, that Mary Magdalene, in her connection with Sophia, continues to ask. They are not questions that can be answered once and for all. They are questions that must be lived, explored, wrestled with again and again. The hidden wisdom of Sophia returns not because it was ever truly absent, but because each generation must discover it anew. It returns when someone reads an ancient text with fresh eyes and sees something that others have missed. It returns when someone challenges an unjust practice and opens up new possibilities for justice. It returns when someone sits in silence and listens to the voice within. It returns when someone takes the risk of speaking their truth, even when that truth is unwelcome. It returns in moments of beauty and in moments of suffering, in times of certainty and in times of doubt, in the company of others and in solitude. Mary Magdalene, as a symbol of this returning wisdom, reminds us that what has been hidden can be revealed, that what has been lost can be found, that what has been sentenced can speak again. She reminds us that wisdom is not the exclusive possession of any institution or any individual, but is available to all who seek it, with an open heart. She reminds us that the journey toward wisdom is not a straight path, but a spiral, returning again and again to familiar places, but each time from a different perspective, each time with deeper understanding. She reminds us that the sacred is present in the ordinary, that revelation happens in gardens and at tombs, and in the midst of grief and confusion, not just in temples and at altars. In the end, the story of Mary Magdalene and Sophia is a story about how we remember and what we choose to honour. It is a story about the power of narrative to shape identity and belief, about the ways that voices are amplified or silenced, about the ongoing work of interpretation and reinterpretation that every living tradition must undertake. It is a story that is still being written, still being told, still being lived. It invites participation, not just observation. It asks not just what we think about Mary Magdalene or Sophia, but what we do with what we think, how we let it change us, how we let it shape the communities and the world we help to create it. The wisdom that Mary Magdalene represents, the wisdom of Sophia, is practical as well as mystical. It is the wisdom of how to live with integrity, how to love with generosity, how to speak with courage, how to see with clarity. It is the wisdom that knows that all things are connected, that what we do to the least of these we do to the whole, that violence and injustice diminish everyone, that compassion and justice heal not just individuals but communities and even the earth itself. It is the wisdom that sees through the illusions of power and status and recognizes the true value of each person, regardless of gender, race, class, or any other marker of identity. It is the wisdom that refuses to be opulent, that continues to speak truth even when truth is costly, that trusts in the power of love to overcome fear. This wisdom is not a luxury or an abstraction. It is urgently needed in a world that faces enormous challenges: ecological crisis, economic inequality, political polarization, violence, and war. The recovery of wisdom, the integration of the feminine and the masculine, the honoring of voices that have been marginalized, the commitment to justice and compassion, these are not just matters of historical interest or spiritual growth. They are matters of survival and flourishing, of whether we will find ways to live together on this planet with respect and care, or whether we will continue down paths of destruction and division. Mary Magdalene, standing in the garden at dawn, hearing her name spoken, recognizing the one she thought was lost, being sent to tell what she has seen, this image holds within it the possibility of transformation, both personal and collective. It suggests that despair can give way to hope, that confusion can give way to clarity, that death can give way to life. It suggests that each of us can hear our name spoken, can recognize the sacred and in our midst can become messengers of good news. It suggests that wisdom is not far off or inaccessible, but near at hand, waiting to be recognized, waiting to be embraced, waiting to be lived. The return of the hidden wisdom of Sophia, symbolized in the figure of Mary Magdalene, is ultimately a return to what is most essential, most true, most fully human. It is a return to wholeness, to integration, to the recognition that the divine cannot be contained in any single image or any single voice, but speaks in many ways and through many people. It is a return to the understanding that authority is not a matter of domination but of service, that leadership is not a matter of control but of empowerment, that truth is not a possession to be guarded but a gift to be shared. It is a return to the wisdom that has always been present, always been available, always been calling out to those who have ears to hear. This is not a return to a past that never was, but a step forward into a future that is still being created. It honours the tradition while also critiquing it, learns from the past while also being willing to leave behind what no longer serves. It seeks continuity and change, rootedness and growth, fidelity and creativity. It trusts that the spirit that inspired the earliest followers of Jesus, that moved in the hearts of Mary Magdalene and the other women who were his disciples, that spoke through the prophets and the sages and the mystics, that same spirit is still at work, still inspiring, still guiding, still calling forth new expressions of ancient wisdom. Mary Magdalene, then, is more than a historical figure to be studied or a symbol to be interpreted. She is a presence, a companion on the journey, a reminder of what is possible. She is the witness who stays, the seeker who finds, the mourner who rejoices, the student who becomes teacher, the silenced one who speaks. She is the wisdom that was hidden and is now being revealed, the voice that was marginalized and is now being heard, the authority that was denied and is now being recognized. She is the one who stands at the threshold between the old and the new, between what was and what might be, between death and resurrection. And she invites all who encounter her to cross that threshold, to see with new eyes, to hear with new ears, to embrace the wisdom that makes all things whole.